السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم ينفعنا بما علمتنا وعلمنا ينفعنا وزد علما يا كريم يا رب العالمين. اللهم نسألك علما نافعا ورزقا واسعا وشفاء لكل داء آمين يا رب العالمين. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, we're here for the session by Dr. Jamal Zarabozo on how do mental health disorders impact one's moral and legal responsibility. The awareness and importance of mental health is something that over the past years has come in front and center among those in pastoral care. And I hope a better understanding has been made overall in our communities. Being aware of mental illnesses and trying to assist those who are suffering with them is of the utmost importance. But in terms of fiqh rulings, it also has a bearing on whether a ruling still applies to a person suffering from a mental illness or not, and how to distinguish takes knowledge and experience of what type of mental illness the person is experiencing. Dr. Jamal Zarabozo in his paper explores first and foremost the definition of the Sharia in terms of what is a mental illness. How do we actually define that? And then navigates onto different type of mental illnesses and the ruling that's connected to them. He goes in his paper about insanity, dementia, physical illness, intoxicants, coercion, anger, and fear. And then the Sheikh goes on to explain schizophrenia and has a case study at the end towards of his paper in an in-depth look in terms of schizophrenia and the rulings and how that applies. So without further ado, we have Sheikh Jamal and to explain his paper.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lahu wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluhu. Amma ba'd. First of all, let me thank AMJA for the opportunity to present this paper, inshallah. And so the paper, as you see in your work, it's a number of pages long, inshallah, and also the nature of a paper should be, at least theoretically, should be a little bit different from the nature of a speech, inshallah. So I'm definitely not going to be following the order of the. More or less, I'm not going to be following the order of the paper, but and also, inshallah, in the amount of time, I just want to highlight some of the aspects that are touched upon in the paper, and inshallah, you can hopefully read the paper on your own to get more details, inshallah. First, let me figure out what should I do here to get the next screen done. I tried there. Okay, nothing's happening. Okay, that looks good. There we go. So that part you already know, mashallah. Inshallah. So let me start off with a case with respect to a famous Hanbali scholar. His name is Ibn Aqil. And Ibn Aqil was asked about a person who, so this person immersed himself in water, trying to make ghusl. He immersed himself completely in water 3 times. And then he came to Ibn Aqil and he said, I immersed myself in water 3 times, but I'm not sure if the water got all the parts of my body. And this way of thinking, it's known as either obsessive compulsive disorder or scrupulosity or waswas al-qahri. So basically, he's asking Ibn Aqil, is it okay for him to pray? He's not sure if the water has covered all of his body. So the answer from Ibn Aqil was basically, you don't have to pray. Saqatat anka salat. There's no salat for you. And the people around him were a little bit surprised, and they asked him, why did you tell him there's no salat? And he quoted the hadith of the Prophet. The hadith of the Prophet, Rufi al-Qalam an thalatha, that the pen has been raised from 3. And among them is al-majnoon hatta yabra. The pen has been raised from three, and one of them is the insane person until he becomes free of his insanity. And he said that if this person dips himself in the water 3 times and he's not sure that it covered all of him, فَهُوَ بِلَا شَكْ مَجْنُونَ. He said there's no question that this person is majnoon, this person is insane. Now, when you say that somebody is insane, from a fiqh perspective, this has all sorts of legal ramifications. I mean, if he's actually declaring the person insane, first of all, as I said, you don't have to pray. There's no prayer for this person. The person is insane. You know, basically, insanity means he doesn't have the mental capabilities, so he's not actually legally even qualified to pray. And of course, there's lots of other ramifications of being declared insane as well. Now, what's kind of interesting in the story of Ibn Aqil is essentially there's no question about, like, for example, this individual who has this problem, his problem could be only with respect to tahara. Maybe once once he gets beyond the tahara stage, maybe he doesn't have any issues, right? I mean, some people, when they go to the salat and they make the takbir, they don't know if the niyyah was at the right moment, and they make takbir over and over again. Some people, this is also part of this same kind of disorder. But maybe this individual who came to Ibn Aqil doesn't have any of these. Maybe his problem was something very specific related to tahara. So the declaration that he's insane, and now the salat and everything else basically is going to be dropped from him. This is a big statement on the part of Ibn Aqil. But it kind of reflects an approach in usul fiqh where essentially insanity is a 0-1 thing. Either you're insane or you're not insane. It seems to make sense. It's not insane to say either you're insane or you're not insane. But the reality is that some people actually might have very specific issues. One brother was here, Brother Iman, he came up with the term domain-specific insanity. Domain-specific insanity. That the individual is not insane, because once you say that the individual is insane, now this is going to impact all of the other aspects of law. You know, we have ritual law, so it's going to impact, for example, whether he has to pray. We have marital law. It could impact the validity of his marriage. We have contract law. If you are insane, if you are truly insane, you're not allowed to enter into contract. And it's going to impact criminal or penal law as well. You'll not be suffering you'll not be facing, for example, the had punishment in general if you have been determined to be insane and you essentially did not know right or wrong from the action that you've done. Now, if we move on from Ibn Aqil to a more recent example, this is about as dark as it can get over here. It's okay. It's okay, inshallah. So a more recent example, which came from a recent PhD dissertation. Yeah. MashaAllah, it's okay. The author of this dissertation introduced us to someone by the name of Nabil. And this person, Nabil, has a number of different, you can say, mental health issues. And from among the issues that he, from among the issues that he was facing, is that when he would go into the prayer, he would have such psychological issues that he would feel immense pain. He'd feel immense pain anytime he would go into the prayer. And again, other things, maybe let's say like making dhikr or reading the Quran or fasting and so forth, maybe these other things aren't affected. But when he goes in the prayer, he feels immense pain, and this causes him obviously big psychological problems, but as well a crisis in faith. I mean, everybody knows the centrality of prayer, and here you are, someone who you're not able to pray for whatever psychological reasons. It's just too much on you. You're in so much pain that you're coming out of the salat in a worse spiritual and physical state than when you enter the salat. And obviously, that's not the purpose of the salat. Yeah, the salat is an obligation, but the salat is supposed to, inshallah, remind us of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and bring us closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, in the case of Nabi Allah, he stated that every imam that he talked to simply told him the salat is obligatory, you have to pray. Period. No excuse for you. So Ibn Aqil, so you have a big difference here between what Ibn Aqil said and how Ibn Aqil approached the issue, and these contemporary imams that Nabil is turning to get a fatwa, can he be released from the prayer? In both cases, obviously, there is something going on. With respect to mental health. And there's no question, I might be a little bit, I'm not used to using PowerPoint. I don't really believe in PowerPoint. I've told AMJA that many, many times. So I might be a little bit behind when it comes to this. Yeah. So in general, you have a dilemma here between, for example, telling someone he doesn't have to pray and the ramifications of that on the individual. And maybe even for the jurist or the faqih who's making that decision, that might be a very difficult decision for that person. But then also to tell a person that he needs to pray when the prayer can actually cause him harm, spiritual harm, that's obviously something that is needed to be taken into consideration. And as I talked about before, the other thing is they always add pictures, so I need to know what kind of pictures they're adding to my PowerPoint. So as I mentioned before, and the judgment, though, if you're going to make a judgment that somebody is insane, that has long-reaching implications. So there needs to be some kind of balance. There needs to be some kind of balance, and the problem for the jurist and fiqh and law in general. By the way, it's not just this kind of issues are not just necessarily restricted just to Muslims, but all law where you have mental health issues, where in general, the law is going to hold somebody responsible when, number one, they are knowledgeable of the law, and they're also mentally capable of distinguishing between right and wrong, that they're doing something that violates the law. And so you want to give as much legal responsibility to humans as you can. The default is every human is sane. So that is something that you want them to be free to enter into business contracts. You want them to be free to marry and so forth. But if in reality they are kind of a harm to themselves, or they are detrimental to themselves, or these kind of actions are harmful to them because of a state that they happen to be in, well, that also needs to be taken into consideration by the law. Sometimes they need to be excused. Sometimes they need to be excused maybe from performing obligations, especially from a religious perspective. Sometimes they need to be excused for some actions that they've done. So it's definitely not a simple, it's not a simple problem that is faced in any kind of law. And so the fiqh or the sharia and the practical aspects of fiqh, this is not something unique to actually the sharia. And then we have another issue as well, because we are talking about something known as mental illness. But what is mental illness? Who's going to define mental illness, and who is defining mental illness? There's a famous textbook on psychology. The authors' names are Gray and Bjorklund. They say that mental disorder, mental illness, or mental disorder, they said mental disorder has no really satisfactory definition. It is a fuzzy concept. It is a fuzzy concept. What is a mental disorder? And then they say that everybody knows that. Everybody, in other words, everybody in the mental health field, everybody in psychology and so forth, everybody knows that this is a fuzzy concept. And then they add, everybody knows that, including the people who wrote the DSM-5. DSM-5. So what is the DSM-5? That is as you see on the screen, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is published by the American Psychiatric Association. And basically, in this work, and as you can see, it's 5, so they had like 1, 2, and 3, and sometimes some amendments to them. It's been around for many years now, and they keep adjusting it and updating it. So here, basically, they are trying to identify what is a mental disorder. And by the way, as I said, this is from the American Psychiatric Association, so it has a lot of influence here in the United States and elsewhere. The World Health Organization, or WHO, they have their own basically work on this as well. But all of it basically, as we described, it goes back to the fact that when you talk about mental illness and how are you going to define mental illness, there is no real specific or strong or clear definition of what is mental illness. And so, even if you compare like the DSM-5 with what the World Health Organization came up with, you see some differences between them. What the DSM-5 contains, also, there's been criticism from different types of professionals as to what they included, as well as what they did not include. And this is an important point, because especially as Muslims get into this field of the mental health field, sometimes when Muslims get into a field, they kind of I don't know, essentially buy into the field as a whole, and sometimes we don't enter into some fields maybe with a critical eye to recognize that maybe there are some weaknesses in the philosophy behind this field. Maybe there's some issues related to this field that we need to be conscious of. And cultural bias. I mean, obviously, when you think of like a mental illness or mental disorder, one of the main things that you can think about related to a mental disorder is where somebody is not behaving in an expected manner. Well, who's going to define this expected manner? So definitely cultural values and expectations are going to be part and parcel of how they're going to define mental disorders. And that's why, the famous example is the example of homosexuality. And how homosexuality has moved from being it was classified as a mental disorder in the first edition of the DSM back in 1952. This classification was challenged by, of course, gay rights activists and so forth. And later they declassified homosexuality as a mental disorder. And then in 1974, the DSM homosexuality was replaced with a new diagnostic code for individuals distressed by their homosexuality. And then distress over one's sexual orientation remained in the manual under different names until the DSM-5 in 2013. So basically, what is going on? Why was homosexuality a mental disorder at one time? and treated like a mental disorder one time, and now it's been completely removed. So, of course, if you know society and what's happened in society, so society is now embracing. Now it's no longer considered by society a mental disorder, so therefore it's no longer considered by the professionals dealing with mental health as a mental disorder. That one may be kind of easy to see, how that happens. Now, obviously, for Muslims, if you're gonna say that, well, homosexuality is no longer in the DSM-5, so therefore, Muslims should also look at it as if we should not consider it something abnormal or something like that. I mean, obviously, this one hopefully it doesn't make any sense to anybody here, but that's the reality of what is going on in the field. There's like an opposite case of the question of, let's say, like shyness. Now, shyness here, I must point out, is not exactly the same thing as haya, but some aspects of haya definitely are related to shyness. So they have these different kinds of, we have like social anxiety disorder and so forth, which include things like if you're afraid of public speaking, like I am, if your hand shakes when you're writing a check of a large amount, like mine does, you have a disorder. Basically, someone with a disorder is speaking to you right now, according to the DSM-5, which shows you how much I might think of the DSM-5. But obviously, these are actually some people have definitely social phobias. I mean, they're afraid to go out of the house at all. But then to include also these kind of things, which are actually fairly common in society, as a disorder, like what must be going on here? Obviously, by the way, the more disorders that you have, the bigger the industry, the more drugs that need to be pushed. But that's conspiracy theories type. I'm not going to get into that, right? But that's also reality. So basically, what I'm saying is that, as I described, mental illness. Don't think of mental illness, like you break your arm. You can look at the X-ray and you can see that your arm is broken. Some types of mental illness, some things that are going on can actually be identified by different medical tests, but many of them are basically up to the conclusion of psychiatrists and psychologists that somebody has a mental illness, and you cannot pinpoint, physiologically speaking, you cannot pinpoint like what is going on, and even to identify particular qualities or particular aspects as a mental illness. As I said, that is going to be very much culturally based, and as I said, we need to be very much aware of that reality. And then beyond that, and of course, the focus of this paper, I'm not. Obviously, how to treat mental illness and so forth, and like what are steps that should be taken, and that kind of thing. This is obviously very important, but I'm trying to focus on one thing here, and that is the legal aspect. How do we deal? How do we deal with mental illness from a legal perspective? And so, as you see on the board there, some things that are described as mental disorders, they clearly do have legal impact. I mean, by the way, the word insanity, to say that somebody is insane, this is actually no longer a medical term. You're not going to see that in the books of psychiatry and psychology. This is now, the word insanity now is purely a legal term. It's purely a legal term. You have, for example, the insanity plea when you're trying to get out of being held responsible for some action that you've done. So, but there are obviously, again, there are cases of people having mental disorders, mental illness, where they cannot distinguish right from wrong. Morally, they don't know that the thing that they are doing is actually wrong. That kind, or they're not able to reason they're not able to reason in a clear, rational manner. So these kinds of mental disorders, obviously, they're going to impact the legal capacity of the individual. And as we said before, the extreme of them is going to be basically what is known as insanity. Right? And as I said before, insanity is going to have all those repercussions, such as, for example, al-hajr or conservatorship, or somebody else is going to be taking over the affairs of that individual. Some disorders may have some legal impact. You know, if you take, for example, the case of schizophrenia, and especially nowadays with different types of medication, different types of treatment, you know, some medication, some treatment is very effective. I didn't mean to downplay that before. So, for example, there are people who have schizophrenia and they are able to live what we would call normal lives. I mean, they can make conscious decisions. They understand like things what are right and wrong, but at the same time, they could sometimes have acute symptoms. Something could be triggered, and there could be times, for example, in which they will be dealt with as someone who is not legally responsible. Different types of disorders have certain qualities to them, like one I'm going to talk about later, anger, for example. And so when a person reaches into that state, other times they are completely legally responsible for their actions. And then because of some particular circumstance and so forth, their ruling is going to be changed. And then there's some disorders that don't have any real legal ramifications or impact. There are such a thing as like sleep disorders, sexual disorders, right? And when I say sexual disorder, I don't mean like what we consider perversions from a Sharia perspective, but other kinds of sexual disorders. So these kinds of disorders, they are included under mental illness or mental disorder, and they're discussed as a mental disorder and so forth. But in reality, they don't really impact for the most part. For the most part, they don't really impact somebody's ability to reason. They don't impact somebody's ability to recognize right from wrong. So in general, they're not going to have any legal impact. And I want to be careful in how I state that, because obviously, if you have a sleep disorder, I mean, all of you probably are pretty cranky when you don't get your 12 hours of sleep or whatever it should. Right? So if you have a sleep disorder, that is going to affect you psychologically. At some point in time, that could actually move from being a case or type of disorder that in general doesn't have any legal impact, but actually if the ramifications of it are so powerful and strong, it could actually also have legal impact as well. Now, when we look into the books of Usul al-Fiqh, and when they talk about basically barriers to legal capacity, what are some of the different cases that because of these things that have come up, the person is no longer considered legally capable, or at least fully legally capable. And of course, they have evidence, obviously, for the different categories that they have. The hadith that I referred to earlier, you know, rufi al-qalam and thiratha, the fact that the pen has been raised from 3, which include the al-saghir, the young, until he reaches the age of maturity, the sleeping person, hatta istiqad, the sleeping person until he wakes up, and the one who was and there's different wordings for this, the one who was afflicted with some kind of mental situation until he recovers. So based on like this hadith and other principles, when you go into the books on usul fiqh, you see the general categorization of the different types of impediments to legal capacity. They are usually broken down into 2 major categories. So maybe you could. It's in your booklet there. Basically, one, they call that the result of the acts of God, or actually samai, or heavenly acts, and the other ones are the results of the acts of humans. So there are some things which people are afflicted by, and they're not necessarily directly the result of the actions that they've done. And in that category, you have things like insanity, infancy, amnesia and dementia, forgetfulness, sleep, falling unconscious, and so forth. And then the results of the acts of humans, you get things like ignorance. So ignorance is blamed on the individual from the usul perspective. Drunkenness, doing something out of just a joke and so forth, a mistake. And then you have acts which are the result, something which is the result of the acts of humans, but external to the individual. And that is basically the case of duress or coercion. Now, usually, as I said, even some of the most extensive books on usul fiqh, even some of the PhD dissertations that are specifically directed towards the question of impediments to legal capacity, this is basically all you're going to see in these books. And this categorization, right? So, for example, you have insanity, or you have amnesia or dementia. So essentially, what's going to happen if you have a mental disorder, you're going to have to try to plug it into one of these cases. Most likely, it's going to be insanity. But but if you are forced to choose from these alone, as I said, most likely you're going to choose insanity. And then with insanity, you don't have any choice. That is one thing about the law that all of the different madhabs agree upon, and that is that the implications of insanity are essentially required by law and determined by law, and are basically in effect as soon as the person is declared insane. It's not like up to the choice of the family and say, like, yeah, okay, he's insane, but we'll let him go ahead and do business or this or that. No, it is determined by law that if somebody is insane, then basically he loses his legal capacity. Again, it's not up to the individual, it's not up to the family, it's not up to the community, but it is basically something that is determined by law. So it is a serious, with lots of ramifications. It is a very serious judgment to say that somebody is insane. However, so the problem with this, though, as I said, essentially every usuli book, every dissertation I've seen, everyone that specifically is covering the impediments to legal capacity, this is what they're covering. But if you go to the Sharia, obviously the Sharia is based on the Quran and Sunnah. It's not based on just what our ulama and the efforts that our ulama have derived throughout the years and classified. Again, I don't think anyone can claim this is a complete classification that spans all of the possibilities. In fact, if you go into the fiqh, it's clear that this is not the case. So, for example, Ibn al-Qayyim, when he was discussing the question of somebody pronouncing a divorce while he's in a state of anger. Somebody pronouncing a divorce while he's in a state of anger. And Ibn al-Qayyim said the Sharia principle is that psychological impediments, al-awarid nafsiyah, and this psychological impediments, basically only Ibn al-Qayyim and maybe like one or two other people I found making this statement, psychological impediments. So he said that the Sharia principle is that psychological impediments have a legal impact with respect to statements. And what is meant by statements here is that, the legal activity is oftentimes made up by what are known as statements. If you buy something, that is a type of statement. You're saying, I'm selling this to you, you're buying. If you get married, you are agreeing to marriage as a kind of statement. If you divorce, you are making a statement of divorce. So even the Shahada is a statement. So that's what he means by this. So he said that the Sharia principle is that psychological impediments have a legal impact with respect to statements, either disregarding them or considering them or applying them or nullifying them. These are like the impediments of, and then he mentions the ones that are usually mentioned in Usul Fiqh. He said these are like the impediments of forgetfulness, error, coercion, intoxication, and so forth. And he says, thus, from among these, a statement may be applied, while from another it would not be applied. Similarly, in one state, one may be excused, while in another state, one is not excused. And from the ones that he mentioned after mentioning insanity, that I just did not mention just now, he says fear, depression, heedlessness, and confusion. Fear, depression, heedlessness, and confusion. So depression, for example, he mentions depression. Depression, if you think about mental illness, that's one of the main ones that is discussed quite a bit. So if you so in the paper I discussed a couple, like anger, for example, and why I discussed the ones that I discussed. So anger, if you go again to the DSM-5, you can find anger or intense anger mentioned as a key criterion for many of the mental disorders that they have. So basically, for every mental disorder, there's certain criterion that if the person is exhibiting this, right, this is one of the qualities that means this person might have this mental disorder. So, so there's such a thing as intermittent explosive disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, borderline personality disorder, and bipolar disorder. So all of these, one of the main features that you look for before you diagnose someone as having one of these disorders. So it's time to restart your computer. I'll tell it to wait. Okay. So anger, as I was saying, anger is one of the characteristics that you find in many different types of disorders, many types of mental illnesses, and it is something that is taken into consideration in the Sharia. It is something that is taken into consideration in the Sharia, meaning when somebody does, and of course, obviously, there's a lot of details to this. But it means that if somebody does something out of anger, if somebody has, for example, bipolar disorder or even schizophrenia, because also it's common characteristic with respect to schizophrenia. So somebody is having some of these disorders that may lead them to do something and to say something, maybe even say a word of kufr out of anger. But when they enter into this state of anger, and obviously there's, as I said, there's a lot of details. Right? So we're talking about different levels of anger. Most people, when they get angry, they still pretty much have an idea of what is right or wrong, even though when they act out on their anger, they many times do something that they should not have done. They'll say something that they should not have done. They may strike at somebody else when they should not have done, but at the same time, they still have an understanding inside of them that this is not actually like legal for them, and maybe right afterwards they might even feel sorry for it. But you can reach a type of anger. Right? You can be in a state of anger such that the anger now completely overtakes you. And not only that, even why did you get into that state of anger? So that state of anger basically sometimes comes upon you without really anything coming from you to bring it on. And so when somebody is in a state like that, the Sharia does take into consideration this state that the individual was in. Actually, we have a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ The Prophet ﷺ said, لا يقضين حكم بين اثنين وهو غضبان. That the judge, someone who is deciding between two people, he should not make a decision when he is very angry, when he's in a state of anger. That decision, right, if you're going to make a judgment, and if you're in a state of anger, that anger might bias your decision, may make your decision, for example, be much harsher than it needs to be, than it's supposed to be. And by the way, there's like normally there's different interpretations of what did the Prophet ﷺ mean by this. Is the Prophet ﷺ just saying that this is something prohibited, but the judgment will still take place? There's some scholars who say actually the judgment that takes place when a judge decides something when he is in such a state of anger, they say that judgment is null and void. That judgment is null and void. Not all scholars say this, right? Some scholars say the Prophet ﷺ meant by this to prohibit it, but the judgment is still going to be effective. Some scholars say it just means it's disliked. It's not going to affect the judgment. But some scholars say that the judgment then, as a result, if it's the judgment is the result of anger, that judgment, or not the result of anger, but it was made while the judge was in a state of anger, strong anger, that judgment is null and void. So this is again, this is saying that besides the different categories that you saw on the screen before, this is saying that the Sharia does take other emotional states into consideration. And as I said, these emotional states are many times these are some of the key factors or some of the key components in a number of different mental disorders. Of course, probably with respect to anger, the most famous case is probably the question of anger, making a pronouncement of divorce while angry, while in a state of anger. And I will not get into too much detail about that, but again, it highlights the fact that there are different levels of anger. When we're talking about anger, I mean, most likely, for example, somebody's not going to divorce his wife and like he's really happy with his wife and he's like in a state of extreme enchantment, and you're divorced. And most likely there's something you're going to be triggering it, right? Something that's going to cause some kind of displeasure, something wrong going on. And that's when he's going to make his pronouncement of divorce. But sometimes it is possible for someone to get so upset. It is possible for someone to get so upset that they don't even realize what they're saying at that time. The anger has completely overtaken them. And that's the type of case that our fuqaha in the past have spoken about, that in that case, then for many scholars, the divorce is not valid. Because the person was in such a mental state that he was not in control of his actions. He did not know, or he did not realize like what is good, what is better for him in that state. And as a result, that action is going to be overlooked by the Sharia. Another example also is the case of fear. And fear, once again, anxiety disorders. There's all sorts of different disorders that are related to the question of fear. And fear is something that our ulama have discussed in many different circumstances. Now, I mean, we even have something known as Salat al-Khawf. We even have something known as the prayer of fear. When you are in jihad and there's a state of fear, in essence, the way that the prayer is going to be handled is going to be completely different because of fear. Because of fear. There's also a hadith. It's questionable as to its authenticity, but probably for many madhabs it should be acceptable. where the Prophet ﷺ is talking about if you are hearing the adhan and you don't come to the adhan, you have to come unless you have udhr, unless you have an excuse. And when he was asked mal udhr, he said khawf or marad. He said it's either going to be fear or illness. And so again, this shows you that the Sharia does take into consideration this aspect of fear. And so when people have these different kinds of anxieties or phobias, they are afraid of many things, obviously. Now, what makes things complicated, though, if you go into the books of fiqh and you see how do they define fear. I mean, in general, they're talking about fear which is like reasonable. One of the cases, well-known cases, is like if you don't have water at home and then you need to make you need to go out in search of water, but you're afraid that if you go out that maybe there's bears or something out there or lions or whatever. You have a fear of going out because you fear for your safety or for your life. And so many scholars say that, okay, if that's the case, then you make tayammum, you don't go out in that case. The problem with phobias is that the fear is very real to the person who has the phobia, but for everybody else it's not real. They are fearing something that many times doesn't have any reality to it. Which would imply, like, if you take the strict technical definition of fear and how the scholars have discussed fear in the past, you would probably say, well, this kind of fear doesn't apply. But again, we're talking about a situation where the individual is actually not able to distinguish, like, what is a reasonable type of fear from a irrational type of fear. Most people, in general, can distinguish the two. What's that? So I noticed the red light is on, but fortunately, this is not Canada, which is. So one time I was in Michigan, and we went from Michigan to Toronto to attend a conference. And so we had Michigan Place, and one brother, he came up to a light, and it was like green, and then it turned yellow, and then it turned red, and he still went. So the next light, a big car pulled up next to us, and he signaled to us to roll down our windows. He shows us his badge, and he says, in Canada, we stop for red lights. But this is not Canada. So I can ignore this red light. So I'm not going to ignore this red light, inshallah. So a couple of the basically, I think there's room for further development and to discuss things in more detail. In particular, the two aspects of what I call domain-specific insanity, where it is true that somebody is having some kind of issue, but that issue is restricted to certain realms of their life. Again, this concept of scrupulosity or OCD when it comes to religious matters. So maybe when it comes to these matters, somebody has a problem. They're afraid that they're not making wudu completely and so forth. But everything else in their life, they're completely rational. And when they do business transactions, when they decide to get married, when they do all of those things, they are fine. So just to lump this person and say, okay, this person must be insane, like what Ibn Aqil did, this doesn't seem to be correct from the Sharia perspective. And then also things like quasi-insanity, where, again, it's kind of a loose term, where there are definitely some mental disorders, some issues going on where the person may not be, again, insane in a complete sense, in a total sense, but there are some issues in which the Sharia or the law needs to take into consideration their specific challenges that they are facing, and the law is able to accommodate that, inshallah. هذا والله أعلم وبارك الله فيكم والسلام عليكم.
جزاك الله خيرا. Dr. Jamal, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept from you and bless you. Before we get to the question and answer, we have two presentations from our gold sponsors. We have UIF and Islamic Relief, and UIF here, the start showing. Sheikh Saad, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you. So it's time for questions from the audience. We'll start with the sisters first and then go through the brothers' lines. As you guys know, this is the third day of the conference, so everyone has 90 seconds to state your question, and then the Sheikh will have 2 to 4 minutes to answer the question. So first and foremost, we'll start from the sisters. If there's any questions from them, I don't.
Questions are not.
It is on.
Possible.
I have a question. I from what I know, and some people I know that have experienced it, when a lot of times when Muslims go to non-Muslims, mental health care professionals, they have a problem, and there are times when the mental health professional blames their issues on them being Muslim and encourages them to stop doing many aspects of Islam. So I was wondering, do you recommend that Muslims try to find Muslim mental health professionals?
The plug. So actually, in my paper, I have an example of one woman from England who a British convert to Islam, and basically she's wearing niqab, and her psychiatrist or psychologist, I don't remember which, told her that if we can maybe get you to remove that, this would be like a first positive step. So there's no question that what even from the point of view like what might be some of the causes behind your mental illness, which of course is difficult to be able to figure out anyway in general. One point that I did not mention is that but I stressed it in the paper. Mental illness is a kind of ibtila. It is a kind of trial from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And unfortunately, a lot of our literature on Islamic psychology and so forth, they emphasize the spiritual diseases, as if there is a direct link between spiritual diseases and mental health disorder. It is very possible that if you have spiritual diseases, that they are going to lead to mental health disorder. But it's not necessary for you to have spiritual diseases to have a mental health disorder. Because sometimes the mental health disorder, especially those that might be tied into physiological cases, these are types of ibtila coming from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they could even impact someone who is very religious, who does not have, so to speak, spiritual diseases in his heart and soul. So the whole, how to look at mental health, how to deal with mental health, what might be behind it, what are some of the solutions. Unfortunately, in many ways, we should be approaching this in ways that are different than how many non-Muslim specialists in the field might deal with, including maybe even resorting quickly to pharmaceuticals, to drugs, and so forth. So definitely, in a sensitive issue like this, if you think you need help, then I highly recommend, inshallah, that you look for Muslims who are qualified. And alhamdulillah, we have different centers and different individuals who have basically appeared recently, and hopefully, inshallah, you can find help. You can find help which is good and strong and sound from a Sharia perspective, inshallah.
Microphone on.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jazakallah khair, brother Dr. Jamal, about the beautiful, beneficial talk. I don't have a question, but I'm going to shed a light on one angle pertinent to what Dr. Jamal said. So the normal human being would say how a disease can be mental illness and become no mental illness in the same association of psychiatrists, right, with this DSM. Now, for every disease, there is inclusion criteria and exclusive criteria. Example, depression, you have to lose interest in doing things and feel down. That's so many. And exclusion criteria don't have hypothyroidism, do not have mourning or bereavement, right? Now, those people of the LGBTQIXYZ involved with this association. And by the time they disqualify all these things. And this is why 10% of the community go to the control. Now, we are Muslim, we are not happy to be involved in the board of the schools, board of the city, board of this and this. You need to do that as imam and as a family. This is how the rule. Next month, I'm going to go to an annual meeting about diabetes, hypertension, cholesterol, heart disease. From now, we are receiving memos about those LGBTQRSTs. So you need to be involved. I can't tell you, at this moment, there are plenty of books are removed from the library about this subject because of the involvement of non-Muslim American about LGBTQ are removed. So please be active. Unless we move on and we be proactive, it's not going to work.
Jazakallah khairan. Appreciate your comment.
Jazakallah. So he didn't have a question, but can I have a comment?
Yeah, go ahead.
Barakallah. Barakallah for your comment. I would like to just highlight one thing, which I think is also important on this particular topic, and that is when you look at the some of the active Muslim du'at and so forth. There was a time in which like social activism, social justice, what they call intersectionality. You know that we are like a Muslim minority, and then you have women. And then you have like race and all these different topics that were like all, and then sexual orientation is going to be one of them as well. So we're like all, we are the madlum, we are all being oppressed, and so we all need to bond together and fight against the oppression. And so what happened is many Muslims, unfortunately, and I think many of them have recognized and basically like admitted to what they've done. They kind of like went too far, and they saw that rights issues and we're part of this and so forth. And as a result of that, some of them were even forced to embrace some of the LGBTQ platform and so on. Now, at the same time, we don't want to make the same mistake again. So now it's the conservatives who are coming to us and saying, hey, look, there's some morality things that are the same between us. Why don't we work together in the school boards and so forth? So like what the brother said, we need to work to remove things which are going to be forced upon our children. But we have to be cautious. We have to be aware, right? We don't want to make the same mistake that we made before. That we this is a political expression here, right? That we jump in the bed with this right wing now, and then end up being forced to endorse things that we don't want to endorse on this side either. So we should learn from our mistakes, inshallah, and be more cautious moving forward, inshallah.
Jazakallah khairan. From the brother's line to the side, go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum. My question is, in terms of gene possession and mental illness, and when things happen in the communities and the parents come thinking their children have gene possession and they want you to do ruqya, versus when you are not a mental health specialist and you think they need a psychiatrist, and they think telling them they need to see a psychiatrist is putting stigma on the family. How do you negotiate that?
So the case study that I talked about in the paper is the case of schizophrenia. And schizophrenia, one of the common aspects of schizophrenia is basically hearing voices. And so once an individual says that they're hearing voices, so immediately the jinn question kicks in. And unfortunately for many Muslim parents, it's jinn and only jinn. There could be nothing else. And there's such a mental stigma there's such a stigma on mental health issues. As I said, mental health issues, this is an ibtila, this is a trial from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Somebody could be very righteous and is afflicted with this. But there's such a stigma on it that people would much prefer to say that my child is afflicted with jinn than my child has a mental health issue. And so there has been sometimes an insistence that no, this is just an issue of jinn. And I personally have, unfortunately, been aware of some cases where, that kind of insistence of this and dealing with a mental health issue and in a way that it must be jinn and so forth. Every time I've seen where this was essentially a misdiagnosis, this harmed the religiousness of the individual involved. They were actually psychologically affected by what the Imams made them go through and how the Imams treated them, while in fact they were in need of completely different treatment. And it's also been my experience with people who deal with jinn. So people who deal with jinn, we have basically two classes of people who deal with jinn. Those who deal with jinn and they have lots of knowledge about it from the Quran Sunnah, and they have lots of experience dealing with jinn, and those who basically are like, so to speak, they're just like, I don't want to downplay Imams or anything, but they're just like Imams. They know how to do ruqya, and so they think, yeah, this is my job, I'm the Imam and so forth. But they don't even know. I mean, I've been involved in some cases where the Imam doesn't even know, like, what are some of the clear signs that this might be jinn or not. So usually the ones who are really qualified in dealing with jinn, and some of them I've spoken to and discussed this issue directly. For them, it's like it's a pretty quick and clear case. Does this person need me, or does this person need a specialist in mental health? But we need to open the door to say not everything is jinn. Sometimes there are mental health, and there should be no stigma necessarily attached with mental health, because immediately people might think of, again, disease in the heart, some sins that they might be committing, but that doesn't necessarily have to be.
Jazakallah khairan. We'll go back to the brother's line here in the middle.
Assalamu alaikum. Hayakum Allah Shaykhana. I have a question regarding, we know the concept in the Quran, وَمَن نُعَمِّرْهُ نُنَكِّسُ فِي الْخَلْقِ, that as we age more, we naturally have a bit of a regradation in terms of our physicality and also our mental state. Hence, oftentimes, even though I'm aware of the injunction for us to respect our elders involved in the community, let them be the ones who have much of the authority and say, but often that comes into a bit of clash with if they have a bit of mental regardation, or if they're an elder in the family and we want them to speak and mention what they want to say and try to follow them and not disrespect them, though at the same time we want to do what is most logical and beneficial for the family in totality. So how do we go about this in a respectful manner, upholding their rights and the rights of the family?
So the case of dementia, as you said, I mean, obviously it's pointed to in the Quran, and is something recognized by the fuqaha throughout the years. But dementia and other similar disorders, many times they come on slowly. So you have an elder, as you said, you have an elder either in the family or in the community, where it becomes clear to some of the individuals that there's something going on, and this is difficult on again, just like what we were saying about mental health. It's difficult to accept this. Some people are not, some people, and then I'm not talking about necessarily the individual, but like the others around it, like the wife or the children. Like it's difficult. Sometimes it is difficult for people to face reality. And that's why I'm going back to that kind of like same concept again, but like as you referred to, this is something. This is something that's even referred to in the Quran as basically like this is almost natural. It happens a lot. It's going to happen. It's not a negative reflection on anyone. And so I think the best way to approach it is for people to have a frank, the members of the family, or if it's a community, it might be a community issue, for them to to have an open discussion about it and be very frank about like this is what is going on. We should recognize the person is having like these kinds of limitations, and these are probably going to be growing over time. So we need to be ready that more and more they're going to have to be removed essentially from places of responsibility. Their word is not going to have the same kind of word as it had before. So I think there's no hard and fixed rule on that, but I think recognition, communication, everybody recognizing that this is something natural. It's not a sign of punishment from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or anything like that. And by the way, these types of ibtila, so I keep describing it as a type of ibtila. The ibtila is not just with respect to the individual who is facing this. So for example, as the old person starts developing dementia, this is not just an ibtila for that person. It's an ibtila for the people around them as well. And if somebody has, let's say, like schizophrenia, it might be, if somebody, for example, goes completely insane, well, alhamdulillah, I said alhamdulillah, right? They are no longer legally responsible for their actions. But how the people around them deal with them, they are. So that person, from the perspective of ibtila, there's no longer any ibtila for that person. But how are the people around them dealing with it? Are they fair and just and honest and accepting this as a decree from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? They are now the ones who are being challenged. And so in that case, they have to recognize that this is what is going on, and now it's their responsibility to respond appropriately, given the limitations of the individual.
Barakallah fiqh. We'll go to the brother sideline, then we'll come over to the sisters.
Assalamu alaikum, Shaykh. You spoke about the situation where the obligation of prayer is lifted. That you can say is like the worst case scenario. But what happens for a person who isn't, their mental capacity is not so bad that they are not obliged to pray anymore, but they are very hampered by the obligation of the prayer, specifically when it comes to wudu. Like there's folks I know that make wudu 20, 30 times and break their salah, multiple dozens of times because they feel they missed something or their wudu broke. And then one salah ends up taking them a very, very long time. So for a person in that situation, and they're getting, mental help and whatnot, when do you say to this person that you can join the prayers? You can pray Dhuhr Asr together, you can pray Maghrib Isha together with one wudu, right? What is like what are your comments on that? Jazakallah khair.
So I would say if somebody is badly afflicted with that, I would tell them that they're like an individual who has trouble controlling either urine flow or gas or whatever. So they make wudu once. They make wudu once and they pray. And if they are worried about the perfection of their wudu, also don't tell them just do what you can to make wudu, and then go ahead and pray. You are like these categories of people.
Correct. I've told that to them about Salas al-Bawl, but they said I still don't feel I've done wudu. At what point do you tell them that you can do Jamra? Like just make wudu, even if it takes you 10 times, 10 tries to do a satisfactory wudu, but then pray 2 salahs together, just for the sake of, for lack of a better word, your sanity and your family's sanity.
I would say it depends on I'd have to know the individual.
Okay. Inshallah.
I cannot necessarily give a general statement.
Okay.
But inshallah, try to work with the individual. Try to make them realize that number one, the Sharia is not here to punish them. And these things should be actually actions which are taking us closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and not something that is like a torture that is actually affecting our deen, our spirituality in a negative way. And try to make that clear to the individual, and also make them realize that inshallah, if they are patient, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala hopefully will reward them for the afflictions that they're going through. And that, try to make them as optimistic and positive as possible.
Barakallahu feek. We go to the sisters.
Assalamu alaikum. I have a doctorate in clinical nutrition, and I help patients with medical nutrition therapy in the clinical setting. So I'd like to ask about a different type of mental health condition under the umbrella of eating disorders in Ramadan. Anorexia, bulimia, binge eating disorders. So a lot of young women and even older sisters, they suffer and they're very triggered when Ramadan comes around. And it's not so much about people understanding, their family members understanding, and the community understanding. They don't believe that this is actually a real condition, but it is categorized under the DSM-5 as being psychological, mental, and physical and socially distressing. So I'd like to ask if you have any insight on how we can handle this, because it can be at times, in extreme cases, life-threatening. And on the milder side, they can cause anemia, micronutrient deficiencies, which can also perpetuate the mental health conditions. Jazakallah khair.
I apologize. The acoustics up here are not the best, so sometimes some of the wording, when people ask questions, are not that clear. That's why I'm trying to listen as closely as possible. But I think, inshallah, I got the gist of the question. So eating disorders, especially like when they kick in with respect to Ramadan, and sometimes these eating disorders can actually be a threat to the life of the individual. All of us know, if we think of the concept of maqasid al-sharia, if your life is at risk, if you're going to fast, then everybody knows that obviously the fasting is lifted from you. But the problem with these eating disorders, as is the case with so many mental health issues, is that the individuals are not necessarily seeing clearly. I mean, it's not, you cannot always speak to them like in a very rational sense. That maybe also goes back to some of the other questions as well. And that's something that you always need to be aware of. So sometimes you might think, well, this is the fiqh principle. I can show you from many different scholars. They gave this kind of like fatwa, and just apply this. But what's driving them is something on a different level many times. I mean, obviously, just remove this question from religion, for example, from fasting in Ramadan. People have eating disorders to such an extent that they're putting their life at risk. Right? They're not doing this eating disorder, to please God or anything like that. But they're basically their mind is so confused about like what they need to be. Maybe like one sister I know, she like saw her face in the mirror and she felt like there was too much fat on her face or something, and then she stopped eating. So this is not like a rational. There's other things going on which cannot necessarily be dealt with on a rational level. So you need to be there to be there with them, for them to support them, and kind of understand that this is the kind of thing that's happening. I mean, if you many people are good, let's say, like dealing with young children, when young children do things that maybe they're not supposed to be doing, and you deal with them a certain way because you understand that they don't understand. So a lot of times mental health issues are also of that nature as well. They don't understand. So they need someone who is like compassionate and being there for them and trying to help them go through it. But in the end, you may not, you may not be able to convince them. And the most you can make dua that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, any oversteps that they've done, either harming themselves or not practicing something and the way that we think of how it should be practiced, make dua that Allah, forgives them because of the state that they are in. And as I said, many times the ibtila is more on the people around them than the individual themselves.
What would the ruling be if they did not fast? Would they have to make it up?
So I mean, in general, if they're like otherwise physically capable and they're not fasting, then they will make it up at a later date. But obviously, they have to be their mental situation needs to be better, because otherwise you're going to be facing the same issue again. So only when their mental state gets better. And of course, if you're maybe talking about many, there's different opinions about like if there's many years of fasting, or also, one of the rulings concerning basically if someone was in a state of insanity, there's different opinion about like if that insanity was from birth and then one day all of a sudden they became sane, or if that was like they were sane and then they became insane for some time and then they became sane again. What is the ruling concerning making up the misdeeds? And so actually in the paper on the ritual acts, I do discuss the different views. I discuss salat and zakat and so forth, inshallah. So if it is something, if it's a small number of days, for example, of a recent Ramadan, then probably they could be able to make it up. But if it's like a long and many days that are going to be maybe even more harmful for the person, then inshallah those will be dropped from the individual.
We have time for one more question. 2 minutes left, so we'll come from the brother in the middle. And apologize for those who won't be able to answer questions, but Dr. Jamal is here. We have a break after this. Maybe you could approach him privately, inshallah ta'ala.
If you would ask yes or no questions, this would make it much easier.
Jazakumullah khairan. I have two questions. The first question is, can al-waswas al-qahri be considered mental illness? That's my first question.
Can be considered what?
Al-waswas al-qahri can be considered mental illness?
Yeah. So it's usually in English, it's either called OCD, or when it comes to religious aspects in particular, it's called the scrupulosity.
Okay. My second question is, as I say, al-junun funun. And I think you articulate that in your lecture, that even the anger itself, it can be different categories. But as an imam, we encounter a lot of people in the community who come into us, our offices, children. We don't know whether they abuse drugs or something related with their mental illness. When we going to draw the lines in order to consider someone has a mental illness or not? Or maybe how?
Well, I mean, again, if you're just an imam and you don't have experience in this field, then you need to find maybe someone you can consult with to discuss it. I mean, it's not just because you're imam and you look at it and say, well, okay, I think this is mental illness or something.
But the problem is the Muslim community thinks that imams, they have, magic sticks and they can take care of things. And also sometimes in the audience, in the, congregation, there is certain individuals that you don't know. And also for privacy perspective and many other issues, it's kind of very difficult to. So do you?
Yeah, and as I said, there's a lot of stigma attached to mental health issues.
Exactly.
And actually, in the introduction to my paper, I talk about some of the possible causes of mental health issues, and in particular, I stress Muslim American youth. So, in American society, this is called the age of anxiety. Anxiety itself is a kind of mental, it's a mental factor. But and the youth are, because of social media and all sorts of things, they are at more risk. And then if you take Muslim American youth and you look at all the factors, they are even at greater risk of the possibility of having mental health issues. So it is something. So we as a Muslim community, we have to recognize this fact, and imams need to recognize it, get at least some kind of understanding maybe at least find some people that they can reach out to, that they can consult with when issues come up.
Also,
We
I
have,
find out
but we have to stop now. It's over 9:30. We have a break right now. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you and all of you. We'd like to thank Dr. Jamal. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you and preserve you. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept this session for us and put it on our scale of hasanat and yawm al-qiyamah. Subhana rabbika rabb izzati amma yasifun wa salamun al-mursaleen walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. We have a break until 10 o'clock and then we'll resume after that.
Assalamu alaikum. For the brothers who are checking out today, checkout is at 12:30, and for the sisters, checkout is at 12:30 p.m. If you have bags, you could bring them, leave them in the front desk, in the front lobby area, inshallah. So make sure you check out of your room by 12:30 if you're checking out today. Assalamu alaikum.